The 1990s was a golden era for animated television shows, a decade that saw the debut of some of the most beloved and successful shows of all time. 1991 saw Rugrats make its debut. Classic cartoon Doug debuted on Nickelodeon on the same day as Rugrats. In 1993, Beavis and Butthead graced our screens for the first time. And later in the decade, two of my favorite animated shows broadcast their first episodes: Dexter's Lab in 1996 and Johnny Bravo the following year. The list of classic cartoons from this era is endless, but in this video, we're going to take a look at a quirky and somewhat obscure animated series that aired briefly in the early 1990s, Fish Police. Based on a comic book of the same name, Fish Police follows the adventures of Inspector Gill, a detective of the Fish City Police Department solving various crimes in his city, juggling his off-and-on relationship with Pearl White and the flirtatious advances of Angel Jones, and his relationships with a whole host of other characters that you can be sure have names that are derived from fish. Trust me, there are a lot of fish puns in this show. The show was ultimately unsuccessful, only lasting 6 episodes, but I have some very fond memories of watching this when I was young, in particular this show being on the television as my family and I were setting up our Christmas tree one year. So I thought I would take a look back at it with fresh eyes to see if this show is a hidden treasure or just a fish out of water. Before we get started, a huge thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the channel so far, and if you haven't done so already, I would very much appreciate it if you could. You can also support the channel by becoming a channel member, where Nostalgia Nights get a shout out in the video and early access to all future uploads. To understand the origins of the Fish Police animated television show, we have to go back to 1989 and the debut of The Simpsons, a show that is unquestionably the greatest animated television show of all time. The show was an instant success and led other networks to attempt to come up with their own hit animated shows to compete. ABC began development of a show called Capitol Critters, which began airing in early 1992, following the lives of mice, rats, and roaches living in the basement and walls of the White House. The show had quite an impressive cast of voice actors, including a young Neil Patrick Harris voicing Max, but was ultimately cancelled after just 2 months, with only 7 of the 13 episodes produced being broadcast. The remaining episodes were broadcast by the Cartoon Network a few years later. CBS had 2 attempts at producing animated shows to compete with The Simpsons. The first was Fish Police, which we'll talk about soon, and the second was Family Dog, which is widely considered one of the worst animated television series of all time. Despite having both Steven Spielberg and Tim Burton as executive producers, the show was plagued by production delays, and when it was eventually broadcast in 1993, it was ridiculed for its crude scripts and cheap production. Suffice to say, this was a dreadful animated show. This brings us back to CBS's first attempt to compete with The Simpsons, Fish Police, which started life in 1985 as a comic book series created by cartoonist Steve Moncuse. The comic focuses on Inspector Gill, a fish detective, and his escapades fighting crime in a fictional underwater city. The plots and dialogue in the comic were reminiscent of film noir, and while not a huge commercial success, the comic received positive reviews from critics. A total of 26 issues were created and are definitely well worth a read. The animated show was developed and produced by Hanna-Barbera, who had previously produced the likes of the Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, Top Cat, The Jetsons, Wacky Races, Hong Kong Phooey. To be honest, the list of hits Hanna-Barbera produced goes on, and so when they pitched Fish Police to CBS, they decided to pick it up, and a total of 6 episodes were created. The show was taken off the air after just 3 episodes due to low ratings, with the remaining episodes being shown internationally in the coming years, making this one of the biggest failures of its time. But before we talk about this show's weaknesses, let's look at one of its biggest strengths, the cast of voice actors that were brought on board to voice the characters. Firstly, we have the main character, Inspector Gill, voiced by John Ritter, who was best known for playing Jack Tripper on Three's Company. Gil is an astute and skilled detective who sees things very black and white, but is caught in a bit of a love triangle between his two main love interests, Pearl White, the owner of the diner that Gil frequents, and Angel Jones, a singer at Calamari's club. Pearl was voiced by Megan Mullally, perhaps best known for playing Karen in the sitcom Will and Grace, while Angel was voiced by JoBeth Williams. A running theme across the 6 episodes is that Pearl wants to take her relationship with Gil to the next level, but is frustrated by how predictable their relationship has become and how often Gil lets her down. Pearl displays her distaste for Angel at every opportunity, and is very jealous of Angel's flirtatious advances towards Gil.
Angel could be completely innocent.
Not since she was 14.
The main bad guy of the show is Calamari, a squid crime boss voiced by the great Hector Elizondo, who has appeared in numerous hit movies including The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, American Gigolo, Pretty Woman, and Beverly Hills Cop 3. Calamari often appears alongside his bodyguard Muscles Marinara, who is voiced by Frank Welker, one of the most successful and prolific voice actors of all time. Frank is best known for voicing Fred Jones in the Scooby-Doo franchise, and his films have amassed a total worldwide box office gross of $17.4 billion. We also frequently see Sharkster, Calamari's sleazy lawyer, voiced by the incomparable Tim Curry, who puts in a great performance in this show.
I think you'll be particularly pleased with what I dredged up.
There are a whole host of other supporting characters in the show, including Police Chief Abalone, voiced by Ed Asner,
Inspector Gill, how nice of you to join us.
Mayor Cod, voiced by Jonathan Winters,
Threats? What threats? They didn't mention me, did they?
Taxi Driver Krabby, voiced by Buddy Hackett,
I say you take that 8-legged suction cup downtown and you grill 'em.
Goldie, the secretary at Gil's police station, voiced by Georgia Brown,
I tell you what, reach for his wallet. If he doesn't move, you're a widow.
and Tadpole, voiced by Charlie Slatter, who is Pearl's younger brother and works at the police station with Gil, and Tadpole always seems to know what the other characters are thinking before they even say it.
I
lifted prints from the brick table and lead pipe,
and
and
see if you can get a lead on the 32 automatic. Go.
So we've got the powerhouse that is Hanna-Barbera, an incredible lineup of voice actors, and a unique underwater setting. Why did this show fail so miserably? Well, for me, there are 3 main issues. Firstly, the storylines. The first episode is called The Shell Game, and when the owner of Clam's casino is found murdered, Angel becomes the prime suspect. But Gil is convinced that Angel is innocent and that there's something more sinister going on.
Can't you smell it? Somebody's trying to stick it to Angel.
So what else is new?
Chief, you gotta give me 24 hours to prove Angel's not guilty.
The second episode, A Fish Out of Water, sees Gil get a new partner, Inspector C. Bass, a new Casanova cop who thinks he's better than everyone else, but is secretly corrupt. This character was actually voiced by the incredible Phil Hartman, adding further to the crazy voice talent this show was able to attract.
Hi, Angel. Are you here to show me your little piece of heaven?
Yeah? You want to take the tour?
Baby, I always travel first class.
The third episode is all about Gil protecting the competitors in the annual Fish City Beauty Contest, and the fourth sees Gil investigate the murder of the Codfather, a high-ranking mob boss. The penultimate episode is one of my favorites when Calamari employs a Gil doppelganger to infiltrate the Fish City Police Department, and the final episode sees Gil investigate a theft while having to deal with accidentally asking both Pearl and Angel to the charity ball. All of these storylines are relatively simple, and they all end in a fairly predictable way, and it's this that's one of the show's downfalls. The storylines just aren't that interesting. They may have been interesting for a younger audience who wouldn't be able to follow a more complicated story, but this show was targeted at adults who likely lost interest fairly quickly. If they had added a little more detail and made the storylines less predictable, I think this show could have potentially been successful. But this is just one of the issues this show has. The second is the animation style. The show seems to be caught between looking like a kids show but attempting to be a show for adults. The animation looks quite childish, something you would expect to see on the Cartoon Network, but at the same time you have quite a bit of suggestive humor and innuendo that clearly targets an adult audience, and the problem is that the animation style doesn't reflect this tone at all. The show's overly cartoonish designs and exaggerated characters make it look like something you'd expect to see on Saturday morning TV for kids, but it feels completely out of place in a series trying to capture the gritty noir vibe of a detective drama. Take the main character, Inspector Gill. His design is goofy and a bit silly, which clashes with the serious situations he's meant to be handling, like solving murders and dealing with corrupt colleagues. And the supporting cast isn't much better, with their slapstick movements and overly exaggerated expressions. This mismatch between the visual style and the content likely left viewers confused. Adults who might have appreciated the humor and storylines were turned off by the juvenile look of the show, while kids were likely bored or didn't understand the more mature jokes. If the animation had leaned into a darker, more atmospheric style, it might have been better suited to its intended audience. The third major issue with Fish Police lies in the characters. Despite boasting an impressive voice cast, the characters themselves feel underdeveloped and at times one-dimensional. Inspector Gill, the main character, is meant to carry the show, but he lacks the depth or charm needed to make him a truly engaging protagonist. He's your typical detective archetype, hard-working, dedicated, a little bit unlucky in love, but there's nothing particularly memorable or unique about him. The occasional hints at his personal life or romantic struggles with Pearl and Angel are surface level at best, leaving little room for viewers to connect with him on a more deeper level. Then there's the supporting cast, which doesn't fare much better either. Pearl is the classic good girl character, while Angel Jones takes on the role of the flirty and mysterious love interest. Both characters are relatively one-dimensional, and their interactions with Gill rarely go beyond the predictable. Then there's Calamari, the mob boss, who is essentially just a walking fish pun. While he has moments of humor, his character doesn't bring much substance to the story beyond being a generic antagonist. Even the more interesting characters like Inspector C. Bass feel underused. Phil Hartman's performance is fantastic, but the character's corrupt nature is so obvious and exaggerated that it loses any potential intrigue. For a show like this to succeed, the characters needed to be more nuanced and dynamic. But Fish Police gives us a roster of characters that feel like they're just there to deliver fish puns and fill screen time. So ultimately the characters, much like the storylines and animation style, didn't have the depth needed to hook an audience. Having said all of that, there's something about Fish Police that I like, which I think goes back to my first experience watching this around Christmas time when I was young. For me, it's just one of those things that takes me back to my childhood and reminds me of a simpler time when I could just sit in front of the TV and get lost in whatever was on. Rewatching it recently transported me back to that time, and even though Fish Police has its flaws, there's a charm about it that's hard to explain. Maybe it's the quirky characters, the over-the-top puns, or just the nostalgia of it all. It's not a show I would call a masterpiece, but it's definitely worth watching at least once if you've never seen it before, if nothing but for the novelty of experiencing something so unique and bizarre. It's a show that stands out as a curious relic of 90s animation, very indicative of a time when creators weren't afraid to take risks, even if they didn't always pay off. Fish Police might not have made any waves, but it's an interesting dive into what could have been. Many thanks for watching, everyone. If there are any other animated shows that you'd like me to cover on the channel in the future, I'd love to hear your suggestions in the comments below. And while you're down there, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks everyone, and see you in the next video.